On a cold December morning in 1986, boy, do I remember this. I was following this. You had live coverage on this. I was following. It's the most amazing thing happened, folks. A fuel-laden Voyager struggled to become airborne to begin her journey around the world. On one tank of gas and without refueling, the carbon composite honeycomb sandwich airplane, a canard, by the way.
That's right.
Designed by Dick Rutan, Dick's brother, would fly around the globe, taking off from Edwards Air Force Base in California on December 14th and landing 9 days, 3 minutes, and 44 seconds later. Can you imagine being inside of an airplane, you were sitting in the upright position, but you couldn't stand in that airplane. There was not enough room to stand in there, was there?
No, not even that. You couldn't even sit up. It was probably about 2 feet high.
9 days, 3 minutes, 44 seconds later, on December 23rd, Voyager set an absolute distance record and many other world records that remained unchallenged today. Dick Rutan, ladies and gentlemen, is live in the studio with us. There's a mock-up of the Voyager at the EAA in Oshkosh, and if you look inside, you think, how could two people possibly be in there?
Yeah, it's a replica of the fuselage.
Replica of the fuselage, a mock-up.
Just the actual size. And what's nice about it, the airplane hangs in the National Air and Space Museum, the actual airplane, right by some other famous airplanes. But the one here at EAA in Oshkosh, you can actually walk up and look inside of it. And most people look at it and say, obviously, this is just a replica. I mean, it's just a scale model, right? Nobody could actually live in there. But actually, what the deal was, that the smaller it was, the farther the airplane goes. And, of course, performance in range was the ultimate goal of the project. And my brother said that he's going to design it just big enough and satisfy the other requirement for the world record. The Federation Aeronautique Internationale that sanctions and certifies world aviation records.
Mm-hmm.
They said that you have to do the flight, and there's a lot of other requirements with barographs and things to prove that you didn't land and so forth. But one of them is that you have to live for 48 hours after you land. You have to be alive 48 hours. Now, it's a rule.
Why is this?
I don't know.
This doesn't make sense at all here.
That's a rule. But Bert said, I'm going to make it just big enough for you to fly the mission and survive the required 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have to live longer than that, obviously it was too big and we just wasted range capability.
This was an airplane that there's never been an airplane that looked like it. It was the most bizarre-looking airplane I've ever seen, the Voyager. I remember it coming to Oshkosh the very first year, and when the crowd saw it coming, they did not believe their eyes. What was the wingspan on that? It was something close to a 747, wasn't it?
Well, that's close. It was bigger than a Boeing 727.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a very unique thing because it had to fly a very unique mission. And in the world, if you're going to design something, most airplanes are designed with huge compromises. There's one guy that says, boy, I want this airplane to go really fast, so the wings get real short. Another guy says, hey, we got to land it on a real airport, and then the wings get bigger. And so it's a compromise between speed and range and all the other things they have. But this airplane was optimized for only one thing, at the expense of nothing else, like comfort or safety or flying qualities or structure. It was all optimized for range in an almost, well, I could say, hideous desire to make it as light as possible so it could carry more fuel. When it took off, it had more fuel percentage on its takeoff than any other vehicle ever to fly. And that was kind of the secret of its range.
When the people that saw this fly that are not knowledgeable about composite construction, the first thing they saw was this airplane would actually flap like a bird. The wings were so the airplane would actually move. You could see the wings moving up and down. Of course, with composites, it's
well, one of the requirements for long range and performance is long, thin, skinny wings.
Right.
And that it's like a sailplane. So we needed the same type of performance, an airplane that would sail a long ways, carry a tremendous amount of fuel, and use fuel very sparingly.
Mm-hmm.
So the wings were long and skinny. And since we wanted an airplane that had more fuel, we had to compromise on weight. You know, the co-pilot cut her hair off. We sanded most of the paint off the airplane with a sandpaper. We trimmed our maps away. We were fanatical. Bert was viciously fanatical about saving weight.
Wow.
We got our body weights to the exact ounce that the flight surgeon said we could fly the mission to exchange that for fuel. And actually, it was kind of a neat thing because it was 6-to-1 ratio. You would take 1 pound To carry 1 pound around the world, it would take 6 pounds of fuel, or 1 pound per gallon. And so when we cut Jeana's hair off and weighed it, the equivalent range was 1/4 of a mile just for her hair. 1/4 of a mile. Wow. And somebody says, wait a minute, here's an airplane that'll go 28,000 miles. That's what its design range. And it actually was capable of that. And we demonstrated that. 28,000 miles. And they says, you cut her beautiful hair off for 1/4 of a mile range. And I thought a minute and said, you know how difficult it would be to swim 1/4 of a mile in a shark-infested ocean? And so we kind of brought that all back into perspective.
The plane was actually 10 times heavier than than the landing weight, right?
Well, its structural
takeoff weight was 10 times heavier than the landing weight.
Well, yeah, that's pretty close. And its structural weight was 926 pounds, and it was its design gross weight was 12,000 pounds.
Oh,
so that's quite a ratio. But the airplane was very difficult to fly. It was virtually unstable. It was so weak. The wings did flap a lot, but they were strong enough just to carry the fuel, but not to enter into a lot of turbulence and stuff. So the airplane was sometimes it was impossible to control. It had very, very poor flying qualities, and its structural integrity was like being surrounded with tons of fuel held up by tissue paper. So the level of anxiety through this whole thing was pretty high.
Were you on the controls constantly through this? Did you have any kind of an autopilot to help you out? Being structurally unstable like this?
Yeah, the airplane, when it was heavy, had kind of a galloping mode that was undamped. That means it would gallop a little bit to start with, and each time it galloped and pitched up and down, the pitching got worse and worse. And so we figured that if you let go of the controls in about 15 seconds, it would self-destruct. So you had to be constant on the controls to keep it until the airplane got a lot lighter. But it did have an autopilot. But the problem with the autopilot, it was very difficult to make an autopilot with the control laws and rate gain schedules to actually control it over all the conditions that it met. And so you'd trim the airplane and get it all stable, and then turn the autopilot on, and there was a series of knobs that you could modify the characteristics of the autopilot to fly under that condition. But if any condition changed, then you'd have to start hand flying it and reconfigure the autopilot.
The testing that must have been involved before this flight, did you actually fill it full of fuel and take off before you actually did the flight?
No, it
never did, huh?
Well, the thing is, we had a lot of money. I mean, we had a lot of no money. We didn't really have any money at all. And you mentioned the Breathe Easy Award, and they were very interesting. From one statement that we made is that when we were offered the $2 million for a narcotic sponsorship, we told them that they didn't have enough money for us to put a cigarette in the side of that airplane.
Good for you.
And we were really poor at that time. But the airplane hangs in the Air and Space Museum today as a tribute not to a billboard for a narcotics company, but as a tribute to what Americans can do if they're turned loose in an environment of freedom and a neat goal and the motivation to accomplish it.
Good for you. President Reagan actually gave you an award 4 days after the landing. What was that like?
Well, that was pretty neat. And when we first met him, it was in Los Angeles, and we were awarded the Spirit of Freedom Award. Bert, my brother, and Jeana and I and our parents, we met in this little anteroom, and they were going to come in, and we were going to say hello and get acquainted and then go on stage and have the formal medal presentation. But we all lined up, and I bought a new suit, and I was really skinny then, and I tried it the other day, and it wouldn't even come close to fitting anymore. Anyway, I bought this new suit, and we were all standing there all excited to meet the president. And the president and Nancy came in, and we were lined up, and they came in and lined up. We were kind of facing each other, two lines of people. And we were really nervous. And then after just a handful of seconds, I realized they're just as nervous as we are. And it was very strange that these are just human beings. And they were really excited about the flight, and they watched the landing, and they were nervous about this. And then pretty soon we shook hands, and we kind of changed places. We made 180-degree turn. And then President Reagan was so intense with Bert, and he just couldn't quit telling him about when he was riding in the cavalry and riding mules out across this country, and Bert was over there having this grand conversation. And finally, we all went up on the stage, and Nancy had to come back and grab Ronnie and bring him out on the stage. So it was, they're really very personable people, and it was really quite an honor to do that.
Dick Rutan is with us, ladies and gentlemen. He's just one of his many accomplishments, of course, first man to ever fly around the world non-stop, non-refueled. A lot of people tried it before you. Jim Beatty actually gave it a shot and didn't make it. One person lost their life trying, and that was the people that designed the Quickie airplane back in the days when I was in the Quickie program.
Yeah, Jeana and I stood beside the airport and watched Tom Jewett die in an airplane that he was going to try to fly around the world in it. That was real sad. The world record that we broke was a B-52, and it had flown only halfway around the world. For us to be successful, we had to double an absolute distance record. You know, most of those records are broken by maybe a few handful of a percentage time, but to double an absolute record, that was quite a task. And it worked. And frankly, I didn't think that we would ever be successful. The airplane had horrible flying qualities. And you asked the question, did we ever test this heavy that morning? We had done a weight buildup on the airplane and do testing its performance, and as the airplane gets heavier and the combination of engines and power, it's very important to achieve maximum range. Mm-hmm. The last flight that we flew in this airplane, these are round numbers because fighter pilots can only remember round numbers, but we were 75% of the actual gross weight we took off with that morning. 75%. And so since this was only a one-time flight, that I could see no reason why we were going to have to practice this thing with that maximum fuel load that morning. And so almost at the very end of the runway, we had an argument about how much fuel we were going to put on board the airplane. And I put a little bit more on than what Bert wanted because I didn't want to do this again. And frankly, I didn't even know if I could fly the airplane because the last time we flew it, it was just virtually unflyable. My hand, after 6-hour test flight, my arm and hand was just numb from trying to control the intensity. And I frankly didn't think I could even fly it. But it was 5 years. I was really tired, and I just wanted it over with. So anyway, we filled it up that morning more than it ever had, like almost 25% more than it ever had on board, and looked down the world's longest runway and released the brakes with full power, and it started lumbering off, and wondering what the next 5 minutes of my life was going to be like. And I remember lifting off. I don't remember it being that short on the takeoff roll that I was concerned about lifting off. And they told me later that we used 95% of that long runway out at Edwards.
Oh, my goodness.
But when it did lift off, I was so excited. And I was saying, look, Jeana, I can fly it. I can fly it. I can fly the airplane. And she's looking, it's got to lay on the floor because it's kind of small. And she's looking at me like, what do you mean you can fly it? Are you crazy? And I was so excited to just be able to hand fly the airplane.
Did you know on takeoff that your wingtips were dragging on the runway?
Yes, we knew that.
You knew that.
And Bert was screaming at us to pull the stick back. But this oscillating mode that we had, it would probably got out of sync on the takeoff roll. And had I done what they said, we all agreed that we'd probably lost the airplane before we even lifted off. So they went down and not up like they were supposed to, and they did damage the wingtips. And but it did. The wings came up smoothly. And
could you see the wingtips from where you were sitting?
I could see them out the peripheral vision, and the more we pulled the nose up and the more lift was transferred from the wheel to the wings with that tremendous load, the wingtips kept going up higher and higher and higher. And finally, I kind of hunkered down so I couldn't see them because I thought they were going to meet up on top of me. But they were stressed so bad that it's just, it was just shaky to even look at them.
When you landed, how much fuel did you have on board?
When we took off, we got back with 1.5% of takeoff fuel. And after flying over 26,000 miles, we had enough fuel for about 600 more miles. So 600 miles is a long ways. But if you've just flown 2,600,000 miles, 600 miles is just barely getting back.
Dick, a lot of people are going to wonder, you're cooped up in that little phone booth, flying an airplane that is completely uncontrollable. You have to have your hand on the stick at all times. When did you guys sleep after 9 hours?
Well, for the first 3 days, actually the airplane burned a lot of fuel to start with.
Because it was so heavy?
Because it was so heavy. Both engines were running wide open. And as soon as we could shut down one of the engines, the front engine, then it became more efficient. So we burned over half the fuel in the first 25% of the flight. So the airplane got light pretty quick, relatively speaking. And then once it was lighter, then it was a little bit more manageable. And then we could, with the autopilot on and set up and trimmed right, we could change positions. One person could lay on the floor and sleep. The other one could get into the controls and monitor things.
So the first 3 days were critical.
First 3 days are really critical. In fact, I never got out of the seat for 3 days. I think it was just approaching the Philippines before I got out of the seat.
Oh, for crying out loud.
But the anxiety level was so high. He says, well, how did you sleep? I says, well, if you consider the alternative, then it's a little bit easier to stay awake.
To put together something this big required you to contact every country that you flew over to get permission to fly over. Am I right? Did you have any problems?
No, we didn't have any problems, and the main reason we did is that, first of all, I wanted to be over the water as much as possible. The weather systems are more benign and more predictable, and there's no rocks in the clouds. If you're flying in a cloud, you very seldom have to worry about hitting a rock or a mountain if you're over the water. Another thing was the political overflight. So basically, we left California and headed southwest, and got into the equatorial trade winds, which go around the world the other direction than they do here in the northern hemisphere. And then we stayed in that all the way around the world, and that basically the first country we came on was the Philippines, and then the Malay Peninsula, and then we're into the Indian Ocean. And the really only continent we flew across was Central Africa. The rest of the time we were basically over the water. And so the philosophy was, if they didn't know we were there, and if they didn't have the ability to detect our presence, why did I care? So we never talked to anybody. We just did it.
We'll take your calls, folks. If you have any questions at 923-1450, we'll open up the phone lines. Of course, if you're listening and you're a Canardian listening in, 1-888-900-1450 is our national toll-free number. And let's take a call right now. Good morning. You're live on KFIZ.
Good morning.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, for Dick Rutan. When you took off, the little winglets on the end of the wings were scraped off. Did that have anything to do with the cruise flight? In other words, the speed?
Well, it did. That was not planned, and we've often been asked, why didn't we put a skateboard out there? Well, what happened is that since this was basically a huge leap in the test flight program, because 25% more fuel, what happened is that the boom tanks, I don't know if you can remember seeing those, but the boom tanks that are way out from the fuselage, they're kind of like a triple fuselage. When they had all that extra fuel in it, the leading edge or the front edge bent down towards the ground, and when that happened, it twisted the wing. It twisted the wing from a lifting wing to a lifting down wing.
Oh, no.
And we didn't even catch it. And I sat there in the cockpit before we released brakes, and I thought, those boom tanks are really bent. But it never even dawned on me that it was going to twist the wings the wrong way. And instead of rolling down the runway like all of our other flights, the wings always lifted as soon as it had some airspeed on it. And I thought it would happen this time, but it didn't. And they lifted, but they lifted down. Some days you get the bear, some days the bear gets you. And so it almost got us that day, and that was not planned at all. But it was kind of fortuitous because they went down, I think they stayed stable during the takeoff roll. That helped us get airborne. And once we got airborne, the winglets fell off, and it hurt us about 1.5%, my brother said. So we lost about 3% of our range. One is we had a leaky fuel tank, and the other one was that we had those winglets gone. And so just before I got out of range of my mission control there in Mojave, and I called him on the VHF radio and said, Lynn Snellman was the weather guy, says, Lynn, I said, we got a little problem here, but we need about 5 more knots of tailwind. And if you can find us 5 more knots of tailwind, we can still make it. And he says, I'll try. And he did.
Amazing. Any other questions?
Yes. How has your life changed since the flight?
Well, it totally changed. It's been quite a journey after that. We were just, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together in Mojave. We lived basically in Povertyville, but going through this 5-year unbelievable experience of putting together this project. And then to accomplish something on the first attempt that I never ever thought we'd ever be successful in. We hadn't flown the airplane more than 20 or 30 hours without a major failure or loss of control or some other big problem. And to head out around the world with things so tenuous, I just thought the chances of success were very small. But then after we landed, I started to meet some other people I never heard of before, like Larry King and Ted Koppel and Peter Jennings. And so our lives totally changed. It was quite a trip. I wasn't really prepared for it because what happened was fame and fortune, I found, are not synonymous. there was some fame, but there was some other people that knew a lot more about the fortune thing than I did. And so that didn't turn out too well. But if I ever feel sorry for myself about that aspect of it, it's all I got to do is walk into the National Air and Space Museum in the mall in Washington, D.C., and stand there underneath the Voyager and look at the Apollo 11 moon capsule, the Bell X-1 that Yeager broke the sound barrier, the Spirit of St. Louis that Lindbergh flew, and the Voyager.
That's right.
And say to myself, I built that son of a gun and I flew it around the world. And all the rest of it mattered. That's the only important thing.
Thanks for your call.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Dick, we had Scott Crossfield on the show here 2 weeks ago.
Ah, Scotty, good friend of mine.
And a test pilot. And I asked him a question, and I said, what do you think about test flying nowadays in the modern era? What are they test flying? And he says, it's nothing like it was in the old days.
That's true.
The government really isn't testing much of anything anymore. It's not as glamorous as it was in the old days. And he said the most glamorous part is in the private sector right now,
Yeah.
with the X Prize. I know your brother's going for the X Prize.
My brother spends a great deal of time
And of
of
course,
each day on that.
the X Prize is they're giving. Is it $1 million or is it more than that now?
Now, the X Prize, they give an award for, it's $10 million for the first
$10 million.
vehicle to go high enough to qualify as a spacecraft and land it and turn it around and do it again and take 3 people without hurting them a whole lot.
Will you be flying your brothers? Will you be flying that one when it comes out?
We'll see what happens.
You can't. This would make a great news story if you would admit that you'll be at the controls.
Well,
for the X
I
Prize.
will. No, I'm a test pilot. I'm an adventurer pilot, and to not be part of that would be disappointing.
Sure. I mean, what better adventure would be to be a home-built aircraft that goes into space, for crying out loud?
Well, the philosophy is, in a nutshell, is 100 years ago, 2 brothers got together and taught the world how to fly. And not only did they actually fly, that they taught the world that they could fly themselves with the stuff that most of them had in their garages. And that's a significant thing. And look what's happened. The space, why should space be the personal domain of governments and multi-billion-dollar programs? It's really not that difficult if you look at what's happening. And so our goal at the change of this century is the introduction of civilians to space. Would that be neat?
Well, neat. It's the most unbelievable thing. And I remember when your brother stood up on the podium at Oshkosh at EAA, I was there, and mentioned that the next big breakthrough in home building will be a home-built spacecraft. And everyone, there was a gasp. 7,000 people just went, ah. Right on, and it's just amazing. But, every big thing that's coming right now in flight, anything that's decent is coming from the home-built movement and not from general aviation, not from the manufacturers. Why is that?
Well, the thing is that the home builders are visionaries, and very clever visionaries and craftsmen. The big aerospace companies or the general aviation companies, they are bookkeepers. And it's unfortunate that we're a little disappointed in lack of visions. The engines were basically designed in the 1930s, and they haven't improved them at all. The aerodynamics, they're building new antiques. The little Cessnas are new antiques. I said they were antiques in 1972, and they quit building them.
Yeah.
And they're still antiques. And so for somebody that wants something new and different and more efficient and more fun to fly, it's in the home built. And that's where this vision comes from. And that's, look what happened with the Voyager. It came right out of the AA.
Were you one of those little boys on a bicycle that would come up to the fence of the airport and watch the airplanes on the airport and dream? Were you one of those?
Yeah, I think my brother and I both were. We had an abnormal fascination for airplanes at the expense of a lot of other things.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wanted to fly, so I went and flew jets in the Air Force, and Bert went to college.
Is that where you got your ticket in the service?
No, I was trained to fly in a J3 Cub by a long-legged crop duster in the countryside of near Fresno, California, and sold it at 16. And Bert and I had been flying model airplanes and little radio-controlled airplanes and anything to do with airplanes. And actually, I thought, I always wanted to do something to be recognized as having done it as a pilot. And I thought my Vietnam experience, combat experience, was probably it. And then when I got out of the Air Force, we came to Mojave and looked around at the consummate dreamer, which is my brother. And I hadn't even dawned on me that it was even possible to fly around the world. And he said he thought it could be done. And then when I looked in his eyes and he was serious, And then I thought what it would mean. Wow, you mean we can do this mission? And then we realized the historical significance of it, and maybe it's the last real big milestone in atmospheric flight.
Mm-hmm.
And once we've done that, I mean, if you can dream it, you can do it. Civilians in space, hey, we can dream that. And we can do that. And I would say that Bert is hard at work at that.
When do you think we'll see the first X Prize? Is there an ETA for takeoff on this? Or is
It
this
probably
something
won't.
you know-
It probably won't be before the Oshkosh convention, but there's possibly something at the Oshkosh convention that has something to do with that. That's all I can say about that.
Ooh, we're-
I've got a question for Dick.
Right.
Dick, do you know how many people are different organizations are trying for the X Prize?
I don't keep up with it. Bert is more into that than I am, but there's probably a half a dozen of them that have said, this is what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. And the neat thing about that is that they're all different. Some of them get towed up to the higher atmosphere, and then they're launched from there. Others have a mother plane that takes it way up and then launches at a higher altitude. So there's different aspects of how they're going to do that. They're all interesting and clever.
We've seen one of the bad things in EA that we've seen is we need tort reform really bad. A lot of the great, brilliant aircraft designers and manufacturers have been sued to death, and it's really bad. Your brother was one of them.
Yep, he quit.
He quit and got out of the movement, and losing Bert to the home build movement was a large blow to home builders. But now I understand, the rumor has it that he may be getting back in. Can you help us with that one? Is there a possibility?
Yeah, I don't know what his plans are. He's a successful designer and has a fairly large, 100-employee company.
Yeah.
And so to have the liability out there that you can get sued and lose everything that you own except your house and probably your company on the whim of some...
Go say it.
I got to be kind, but...
No.
But see, we went through a couple of major lawsuits, both of us, and we spent a lot of money on attorneys, and we get into the court system, and as we watch this whole thing unfold, it's not truth and justice and liability for somebody doing something wrong. It has nothing to do with that, but it has everything to do with theater. Everything to do with theater. And most of what was said in our experience is not true. It's just made up bovine schistology. And I realized that my attorney, if he wasn't as good in the actor field as the other attorney, we were going to lose everything that we had, and it was a terrifying experience. And it's really sad.
Are you
Really
still
is.
flying the Berkut?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty neat airplane.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful airplane.
He made a lot of changes, Dave Ronenberg, to the basic Long Easy. And the Long Easy had some things that could be improved, and Dave has done all that thing. And it's a pretty neat airplane.
What do you see coming down the pike? You're one of the insiders. You know pretty much what's going on. What are some of the things we'll be surprised to see at EAA this year?
The thing that I would really like to see that excites me more than anything is propulsion, is the changes in propulsion. And, air-cooled engines that are designed in the 30s, we need something much better than that, much more reliable and more efficient. And
To go along with that, I think what we need in propulsion is the fuel we burn. And I'm an advocate for hydrogen fuel, and I've been talking to anybody I can about it.
We just had someone on here from the Ford Motor Company, the head designer, and he said there's a possibility of seeing the first hydrogen car yet this year or early next year. And
That's got to be it. When you burn hydrogen and oxygen, what the byproducts are.
Water.
It's water. And we could solve a lot of problems, a lot of oil problems, a lot of pollution problems, and it's the most common element on Earth. When you run an outboard in water, you're running in the fuel and the oxidizer. We just got to figure out how to take them apart and then put them back together.
And
in
the engines aren't that complicated, really. It's just
No.
a storage system for the hydrogen.
That's exactly it.
that's the big problem, is storing hydrogen.
Well, Dick, I want to thank you so much for being on Backstage Live. I know you've got to get back to Oshkosh, and it's just been a tremendous hour.